Hi everyone, my name is Jessica and I'm going to be talking about the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And I'm going to be referring to this as RAWA throughout this presentation. So what is it? This bill provides funding for the conservation or restoration of wildlife and plant species of the greatest conservation need, which includes endangered or threatened species, and establishes related requirements. And this is important because more than a third of the nation's current plant and animals are threatened with possible extinction. And this act would provide close to $1.4 billion a year for the restoration of wildlife populations across the nation. RAWA would also protect thousands of plants and animals before they're at imminent risk of extinction. And so this act would be the largest piece of legislation for wildlife since the Endangered Species Act of 1973 and the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. And I'm currently a resident in California, and for California, they could get more than $50 million a year. There are a few current problems, which is why this act is being proposed and what it can help resolve. So currently, there's 80% of funding is from hunting and fishing licenses and the sales of those, as well as taxes on guns and ammo. And almost half the number of hunters currently in the US have declined since the 1980s. So another large problem is how the state agencies are going to spend these little funds, because virtually all the money for conservation is funneled into animals that people like to hunt or to fish, kind of like elk and trout, but that does leave out other species, many of which are currently threatened with extinction. So the congressional sponsors, there are 2 congressional sponsors that have sponsored this act. There's also a few Republican and Democratic co-sponsors. This bill passed in the House in June on a bipartisan vote, and is positioned to clear in the Senate, where it has 16 Republican co-sponsors and 25 Democratic co-sponsors. So the 2 congressional sponsors, one was House of Representatives Debbie Dingell, and she's from the Democratic Party of Michigan, as well as Senator Martin Heinrich from the Democratic Party of New Mexico. And Senator Heinrich is a avid sportsman, and he's a conservationist as well. And his goal is to protect New Mexico's public lands, watersheds, and wildlife. He has also aimed to support development of renewable energy projects on public and tribal lands. I also wanted to add that one of the many co-sponsors is Senator Alex Padilla of California, just because I'm a resident of California, and he was appointed to Senate on January 18th of last year, and this was to fill the vacancy of Kamala Harris. So there is a large amount of support for this proposed bill. 70% of people do support this bill. 82% of Democrats are in favor, as well as 64% of Republicans and independents. Although there is a few that don't support this legislation because there's some concerns regarding it. There is concern that the funding for this act is weighted too heavily towards states with the largest amount of land instead of those with the most threatened number of species. Some are also concerned because they want a greater focus on plant species, and some feel that 15% is an insufficient amount of funding for the endangered species. And I also wanted to add that paying with debt is what this proposed act would look like instead of identifying a revenue stream. Because this still wasn't a unanimous vote in the House, there were 2 Democrats voting against it, largely because of this source of funding was a main reason why. So bills in the House versus the Senate is a little bit different, but also very similar. In the House, the numerical majority is required to pass a proposed bill or legislation, which allows these bills to be processed relatively quickly, where in the Senate, they do require a 3/5 majority vote or 60 votes in favor of it. Party leaders of the House control the priority of the bills and largely determine which are put on the calendar and then debated later on the floor. In the Senate, the party leaders do have a greater influence and require the majority House leaders to work closely with them as well. The House of Representatives Act of RAWA 2773, where the Rules Committee actually posted the bill and made a call for amendments. They typically do at the beginning of the week, but rather than taking up the version that was passed by the House's Natural Resources Committee, the Rules Committee made a different move and modified the bill to align with the version of RAWA that was passed by the Senate's Environmental and Public Works Committee. And in this, they were thinking ahead to the next hurdle this bill might face, which would be a vote in the Senate. And they wanted to bring the legislation in line of what the chamber has already been debating in hopes that this bill could be passed more easily. The House bill also would fund general tax revenues from the Treasury. And if there are differences between the bills, the House and the Senate would generally work these differences out during conference committees. And the Senate bill of 2372 will be discussed soon, as the responsibility, kind of the ball's in the court of the Senate right now. So the process of legislation. First, laws begin as ideas, and then a representative of either the House or the Senate sponsors this bill. And then this bill is assigned to a committee for study and review, and then put on a calendar to be voted upon. If the bill passes, then it moves to the Senate. So this is where this bill currently is, and the line is shown here. But looking forward, it will go to the Senate, where one of three things could happen to RAWA. The Senate may take up and pass the House version of the bill, or the Senate may modify the bill and send it back to the House. Or the Senate could pass their own version of the bill and convene a conference committee of members of both chambers. And then if this was returned and passed, it would be looked at by the House and the Senate for final approval. And then the government's printing office would print the final revised version, and the president would have a few days to sign or veto the bill. So currently, like I said, the ball is in the Senate's court right now. In California, this act has a few benefits in regards to funding and looking ahead. In the Bay, there could be an increase of 5% in terms of acreage and miles in the floodplains from 2015 to 2025, as well as in the San Joaquin River. By 2025, it's predicted that there could be a 5% increase of native species. There could also be certain translocations of species to increase current distribution. For example, the Santa Ana sucker and Santa Ana speckled dace are two fish that could really benefit from this translocation and funding from that, as well as removing an introduced brook trout species in context of recovering the listed Lahontan cutthroat trout species. So one species of greatest conservation concern that I wanted to review is the green sturgeon. And the green sturgeon is an anadromous fish, meaning it lives in both freshwater and saltwater, and it does have a relatively complex life history. It spawns and rears in rivers, but then migrates to saltwater for feeding and maturity throughout its life. Green sturgeon are long-lived and slow-growing, which means they can be quite vulnerable to many stressors. And this could be blocked access to spawning grounds, like through dams, as well as habitat degradation, contaminants, and poaching, as well as invasive species and insufficient flow rates in the spawning areas. So green sturgeon, for example, would greatly benefit from increased funding of the RAWA bill. So the state and tribal wildlife grants. These grants provide funds for the development and implementation of programs to better help wildlife and their habitat. It's implemented by the State Wildlife Action Plan, and the goal is to just conserve species in general. If RAWA was passed, it would help fund these grants by increasing ecosystem and native species distributions in California, while also sustaining the species' current abundance and richness. It could improve conditions that are super vital for sustaining these ecosystems in California, as well as their functions. In the past, the state tribal wildlife grant provided about $2 to $3 million a year in California for the past few years. And a specific project that the state and tribal wildlife grant has recently funded was the population assessment of Clear Lake Hitch from 2020. And they were granted a little bit more than $340,000 for this monitoring study. And the monitoring study also incorporated previous surveys and studies which were used to manage the future of the fishery. And this is my literature cited. Thank you.